Welcome to Chatter. I'm David Priess. This week, the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, Sherri Goodman, on the military, climate change, and the environment.
He used to say to me, Sherri, stop doing studies, just clean it up. You know, it was hard for me to say to EPA then, okay, Senator Stevens doesn't want us to study and assess this problem, just get rid of it. So we had to figure out ways to streamline. Nothing happens, no negotiations happen in Russia without lots of drinking and toasts and vodka and caviar in those days. So I learned very quickly that I needed my designated drinker. Unfortunately, I always had uniformed officers on the delegation who were willing to step
Able
in,
and willing
to fill that role.
Sherri Goodman, welcome to Chatter.
Pleasure to be with you, David.
I'm so glad you could join me for this because you have such a wealth of experience and interesting stories involving the intersection that I think more people are becoming aware of and understanding, but still missing the backstory and how we got here, which is that intersection between military and security issues and climate and global security. And you've been working on that for a few years. So I want to pull some strings there and talk about some of your experiences and what got you there and what you've learned along the way. But let's go back early on. By the late 1980s, you started working as a staff member on the Senate Armed Services Committee. But what path got you there? What interested you in topics of public service or military affairs in the first place?
Well, growing up during the Cold War, and also because my parents are Holocaust refugees who escaped from Germany in the late 1930s, among the fortunate few able to come to the United States, I always grew up knowing the importance of giving back, serving your country in a responsible way through public service, and of course making the world a better place, what we would call tikkun olam, repairing the world. And in the Cold War, I wanted to work on the major issues of the day. I was really interested in international relations, international affairs, and the big issues during the Cold War were nuclear weapons and the threat of annihilation by the Soviet Union or the US and a nuclear war. So I started out my career, I wrote my first book on the neutron bomb controversy, a failed decision by the Carter administration to try to deploy low-yield tactical nuclear weapons in Europe, which our NATO allies characterized as killing people and leaving buildings standing and undermining the theories of deterrence at the time. So that became my pursuit. And after a few years in Washington and some years in graduate school, I had the opportunity to serve on the Senate Armed Services Committee for Senator Sam Nunn when he became chairman of that committee. And having worked on nuclear matters as a student, as a early professional, I was assigned the Department of Energy's nuclear weapons complex for oversight, which is the weapons labs and the reactors and processing facilities that at that time were producing fissile materials for nuclear weapons. And during the 1980s, all those reactors and processing facilities failed for environment, safety, and health lapses. At the end of the Cold War, when we also didn't need to produce more plutonium, the Secretary of Energy at the time said we're awash in plutonium. And my career went from weapons to waste, as I say. We then embarked on setting up environmental management, environment safety, and health programs for the Department of Energy that continue to this day. And I wrote my first piece of drafted my first piece of legislation for the members, creating the Defense Nuclear Facility Safety Board that just celebrated its 35th anniversary. It's a mini NRC that provides safety oversight for the currently operating defense facilities.
There's a lot of material there to dig into. And part of it is that you were at the Armed Services Committee during one of its golden eras. And if you mentioned the name Sam Nunn in Washington, even 15 or 20 years ago, you would have near universal nods and winks and, elbow bumps saying, oh, good. But I think some people now have lost some of the sense of history and how important Sam Nunn was. So talk about Sam Nunn as a senator, as a person, and hopefully I'm not wrong here. How blessed you feel that you happened to land your first staff job working with someone with such a reputation.
Yes, I do feel indeed very blessed. Senator Nunn was recognized as a very powerful chairman of the committee, someone who himself from Georgia came out of a long tradition of national security and defense legislators from Richard Russell and his uncle, great uncle Carl Vinson, and also was seen as a man with great integrity. Um, to the point that, let's say, we were not allowed to have alcohol at our staff holiday parties. Um, and also in an era where drinking was commonplace,
Mm-hmm.
excessive, in various quarters on Capitol Hill. And also, it was an era of great and deep bipartisanship in armed services and foreign affairs. We worked very closely across the aisle. The ranking member at the time was Senator John Warner of Virginia. Senator Nunn and Senator Warner were deep and close friends and affiliates, and then with Senator McCain later. So that was a very deep bench of defense expertise and talent, and also commitment to the nation to hold our armed services accountable, but to do
Mm-hmm.
so with the best interests of our armed forces in mind always. And so I did feel indeed very fortunate to have the privilege of working for him and with the members of the Armed Services Committee staff.
Yeah.
I was an unusual pick at the time. I was one of the first women. I was a Yankee in a sea of Southerners, and they used to say, "Sherri, we're going to teach you how to talk Southern." Of course, that didn't quite work for me, but nonetheless, it was a tribute to the growing diversity at the time on that committee staff, and I had the opportunity, along with some others, to be in that first wave. So it was indeed, so I came of age thinking that we always work in a bipartisan way,
Mm-hmm.
and working in the interaction. Sometimes that bipartisanship extended, you know, even more carefully with the, let's say, with the House, with the authorizers than the appropriators. If we're listening to a national security crowd, you guys will know what I mean, because I was on an authorization committee, but the Defense
Yep.
Appropriations Committee was indeed very powerful at the time, chaired by Senator Dan Inouye and Ted Stevens, and they kind of changed roles from time to time as the Congress changed leadership. So it was an important era that really laid the groundwork for enabling both navigating through the Cold War and then kind of resetting after the Cold War. Unfortunately, it's an
Yep.
era that doesn't really persist in the same way anymore today. But it's important to remember those times and to, as much as possible, have the opportunity to work across the aisle, because that's how we can best serve the American people.
You mentioned in there, Sherri, that one of your first projects was working on nuclear facilities in the United States. So you're talking about Hannaford. You're talking about the labs and others. I think most people have a general sense of the infrastructure there, but they don't have a good sense of what you introduced, which is the issues of environmental management and waste, and how that was such a crucial issue that obviously had been going on for a while and had not been addressed well. But starting with your time on the committee and then moving forward, when we get to your work at the Pentagon, it was a massive issue and required a whole lot of generating networks and relationships that didn't seem natural at the beginning. You had to create those connections and fuse them together as a first time staffer on the Hill. Walk through that a little bit. Walk through how you even get people to speak the same language when they've been operating in different domains up to that point.
Right. Well, I would say for me personally, that took a lot of trial and error, and because I was quite a young staffer, there are a lot of things I didn't fully appreciate at the time, but I took seriously. I knew the direction I got from my, from Senator Nunn, from my boss, and from the staff director, and it was clear that um, we when the defense there was a period of time in 1988, 89, when at a time when we mostly got our news through newspapers still, before the internet, and the environment, safety, and health lapses of the weapons facilities like Hanford and Savannah River and Rocky Flats and others were on the front page of the paper almost every day. And then that compelled senators and congressmen, members on Armed Services Committee, and then members who had those facilities in their districts to respond. And at a time when the administration itself couldn't fully explain why we needed to continue production of those facilities, that became just too heavy a burden. And it was clear, after 3 Mile Island accident in 1979, which was, a partial meltdown at a civilian nuclear reactor in Pennsylvania, New Jersey area, and that led to a generation of reforms in management of civilian nuclear power plants. That had those reforms did not apply in the defense sector because they were governed by different authorities.
Mm-hmm.
And that meant that the weapons facilities could continue operating the way they had since they were created in the Manhattan Project. You have to remember that all these facilities come out of the early post-Cold War period, the Manhattan era project, and it included not only the wonderful labs, Sandia, Los Alamos, and Livermore, but 9 reactors at Hanford, a
Mm-hmm.
number at Savannah River, and at Rocky Flats. We were processing plutonium, and I recall making a visit there, and someone asked me, "Well, ma'am, are you of childbearing age?" And I don't think I was even 30 yet, and I said, "Oh well, I guess so." And they said, "Well, don't go in that building then, because it's not safe." So I didn't go, but I could see that there were women working in that building where we were processing with a glove box operation plutonium for nuclear weapons, fissile warheads, and within a few months, that whole plant had been shut down by an FBI criminal investigation, and it never reopened. And if you go out where it was outside of Denver today, you can see no remnants of it. It's fully gone. It's now a wildlife refuge, and that thread continues to this day of managing excess defense facilities, cleaning them up, and returning them for civilian reuse.
Right.
So that was the beginning of the era where the Department of Energy and then later, and then the Department of Defense began to understand that they had environmental stewardship responsibilities,
Mm-hmm.
and the whole country was changing at the time, and expected more in every sector of society, and they also expected, our military and our defense, our federal facilities, as we call them, to be responsible for their environment, safety, and health management.
Talk a bit. You mentioned in there, obviously, the Department of Defense, which is unbelievably massive and complicated, the Department of Energy and its various facilities. But what were the other stakeholders involved, both governmental and non-governmental, community advocacy? You had a lot of people interested in this topic at this time. Who were the other major players?
Well, of course, I mean, at the federal level, you had the Environmental Protection Agency, and you had, on the safety side, you had OSHA, and you also had many environmental organizations who were either, some of them like were suing the Department of Defense, um, and you had then state agencies, state EPAs, state natural resource agencies. Um, I mean, later on, as we got into closing bases in the military, which operate also on um, Interior Department lands, you had the Interior Department wanting to have cleaned up bases operating on that land. You also had many citizens around these communities who felt that their health had been affected and wanted the federal government to make good on that. So it was an era of what we call kind of stakeholder engagement and partnership, whereas previously it had been thought, okay, we kind of operate in the national interest in secrecy, kind of the Manhattan era projects of, the public doesn't come into what we do, we know what to do best. And then it was very clear that that was just not going to work anymore. It was also the era of sunshine laws, of also toxic release inventory reporting,
Hmm.
of enforcement of the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, the Superfund law. So there were many environmental laws that were being enforced against private companies
Hmm.
and then also against these federal facilities.
Yeah.
And so it was clear that the departments, the federal agencies, were going to have to get their house in order.
It's one thing hearing you describe this from the staff perspective, especially brand new on the Hill, suddenly having to get your hands around just who are the players that we need to talk to. And, some people are pushing hard this direction, people are pulling the other way. But it's one thing when you're authorizing and when you're providing oversight of government activity from the Hill. It's another thing when you're actually in charge of executing policy. And you did become the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security. Talk us through how that happened. How does a relatively young staffer on a committee a few years later find herself as the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense in this important area?
Um, well, I had the good fortune of, as I said, working for Senator Nunn. We were a relatively small group of staff members who had worked for Senator Nunn, or then the House chair of the House Armed Services Committee, who at the time was Congressman Les Aspin, who then became the first Secretary of Defense for Bill Clinton when he became
Yeah.
president. So, I mean,
Hmm.
it was a relatively small number of defense experts, who were eligible, who had who served in Congress, and he had come from the House Armed Services Committee. He was looking to have people who understood Congress, and also Al Gore was vice president, and Senator Gore had been a member of the Armed Services Committee. I knew
Okay.
him. He was
Yeah.
essentially the environmental conscience of the administration.
Hmm.
And, I was also his person in defense, if you will. He and his national security advisor, Leon Firth, knew they could, if they needed something at DOD, they would just call me up. So, um, I was very fortunate to get what one somewhat might call a battlefield promotion early in my career. Um, and, I had a great group of people that we work with in the Department of Defense. Many, many great leaders in that era. I served for Secretary Bill Perry, as well as Secretary Cohen. We had John Hamre, who was our deputy secretary, had also been on the Senate Armed Services Committee with me. Rudy DeLeon, who'd been the staff director on the House Armed Services Committee. He was also at the Pentagon in a variety of capacities. So,
It's a remarkable group when you reflect back on it in terms of just the sheer, brain power and bureaucratic expertise that group of people you just described brings to the table.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, Michelle Flournoy was in there, started
Hmm.
out, as an office director, made her way up to a variety of capacities and then beyond,
Yeah.
obviously. So,
Yeah.
and I think Kath Hicks was maybe a presidential management fellow
There
when
you
we
go.
first started,
Wow.
but you see how her career has
It all
advanced.
starts there. So
Yeah.
talk through the position itself. As I mentioned, you were the first one to take this position. What First of all, in any position at that level, you have to have the ear and the confidence of the secretary, or you're probably not going to get anything done. So, talk about your relationship with the secretary and those around the secretary, and also what your mandate was covering environmental security for the first time in that senior position?
Well, the mandate was to elevate attention to environment, safety, and health matters in the Department of Defense. And as I said, since I came in with a team uh, of very talented staff that had served both on the Senate and House Armed Services Committee, and many of them were working directly for the first Secretary of Defense, Les Aspin. They'd been his senior staff. People like Rudy DeLeon and Larry Smith at the time. I mean, I worked directly with them. I could go to the front. The great thing was I could go to the front office whenever I needed help on something, and I knew that I would get it. My immediate boss, John Deutsch, who was the Undersecretary of Defense for what we called at the time acquisition, technology, and logistics, was hardwired into many different parts of the government. So, we were well, um, we were well plugged in. And the other sort of shaping context, if you will, in really the first year I served was that we had the base closure rounds that were required by
That's right.
law at the time, and Senator and President Clinton had to accept a round of closing bases early in 1993, uh, many of which were in vote-rich California, and as a result, he wanted to actively lean into the response to those communities who were thought to be losing jobs when their bases closed. And I was on point to develop his five-part plan for job-centered property disposal, as he called it, jobs, so that we were going to create jobs at these bases from the Presidio in San Francisco, down to Tustin in El Toro down in Southern California, and many places
Hmm.
in between Sacramento, Charleston Navy Yard, other places around the country where he wanted both to advance job creation and to fast track cleanup.
Right.
So that fast tracking of cleanup was something that was important to him, and it was a bit of a lift, in the federal government because agencies had been used to being effective, and thorough in their environmental reviews, particularly EPA and state environmental agencies who often didn't trust the Department of Defense, so they wanted to be thorough. That didn't necessarily make them fast.
Hmm.
Um, but yet we had this mandate from the president, and so I even transferred in that era some funds out of the Department of Defense budget to EPA so that they could hire enough staff to keep pace with the fast track cleanup that
Which
they
is
could.
remarkable to reflect back on because, first of all, that is not normal. That is not an everyday activity to do
Right.
it. But the fact that EPA needed the DoD funding to do what they wanted to do, they just needed a champion and somebody who could argue within their own building the benefits of doing so.
Right. And we would have, Secretary Perry he would have quarterly meetings with the communities of the closing bases, and he wanted to hear from them. How were we doing?
Hmm.
And we had various measures and metrics. He was a very astute manager, and he wanted to know, how are we doing on property disposal, job
Hmm.
creation, cleanup, et cetera, et cetera. So we were held to account. And that really helped to drive results. By the end of the administration, 80% of the property had been returned for reuse, and much of it had been cleaned up.
Yeah. So during this period, obviously you have the BRAC, the base realignment closure commission going on, but you also have a lot of geopolitical changes. And you've already alluded to some of it, the end of the Cold War being the big one. And there's actually the opportunity to not only address some of the lapses of the past, like some, I'd say, disregard towards the environmental effects of some bases and training and everything else, but also build for a better future. The building for a better future does take funding, though. And while you were there in the 1990s, this was an era when a lot of people in Congress were trying to cut back on funding, the peace dividend. So, talk through a little bit how you managed during a difficult situation when you had rising and competing demands and fighting for every dollar of funding in a tough budget environment.
Well, David, I would say we really had, yes, it was both and. While there was demand for, let's say, the Department of Defense to do a better job of cleaning up bases. It wasn't an unlimited budget. And in fact, there were many members of Congress, including most particularly Senator Ted Stevens, on the Senate Appropriations Committee, who many may not know is actually the father of the Department of Defense's Defense Environmental Restoration Program. He created that account because he heard from Alaskans that there were many World War II era 55-gallon drums scattered around Alaska
Hmm.
that had been used in that war that hadn't been cleaned up. They weren't necessarily big military bases. They were just piles of old,
Mm-hmm.
fuel drums. And people wanted that eyesore and that contamination removed. So he
Mm-hmm.
created this program. Now, no one associated Senator Ted Stevens with being an environmentalist, okay? But he wanted that stuff removed for his citizens. And he wanted us to clean stuff up, but he did not want us to spend years and years doing studies. He used to say to me, Sherri, stop doing studies, just clean it up. And, it was hard for me to say to EPA then, okay, Senator Stevens doesn't want us to study and assess this problem, just get rid of it. So we had to figure out ways to streamline. And we did some of that. And we did it in part by building that trust and cooperation with the environmental regulators so they could see that we weren't trying to fool them. We were working in the best interest of the citizenry, and therefore we could work together. So we could therefore streamline certain review processes. We could work concurrently in some cases rather than sequentially, so we could reduce the time period for doing something. In weapons system acquisition, we often talk about, does everything have to be done sequentially, one step after the other? Or if you really need a new capability, you have to figure out how to do some reviews, some of the test and evaluation activities. Some things have to occur concurrently on that timeline. Think of it the same way with environmental management and cleanup. You've got all these assessment and reviews, right? So how much do you have to do sequentially? How much can you do concurrently? And so we tried to be smart about it. And the other thing is we brought in communities who in many cases were critical of what the department was doing at their local military base. And we said, okay, we're going to have citizen advisory boards at all our major bases. Citizen advisory board. We called them restoration advisory boards. But they would have a citizen co-chair and a military base installation co-chair.
Wow.
And the purpose of that was to give the community a stake in the process.
Yeah.
They could have their voice heard, and it helped shape priorities. Because we would then be able to say, okay, you might want unlimited funding to clean up Base X, but okay, today we don't have unlimited funding, and this is our sequence. But within that, what are your priorities? Which sites on that base? Which particular sites? Or what do you really care about? Because usually they cared about the things where people were being affected. Maybe water supply was being
Of course,
contaminated.
that makes sense.
But not just general, okay, we've got to, So that way, by building trust, listening to communities, stakeholder outreach and partnership, we were able to we were able to move the process along in a much more constructive way.
If I remember correctly, you had what, 3 different secretaries that you worked with while you were in that position during the Clinton administration.
Yes.
It sounds to me like from reading about your experiences in your new book, Threat Multiplier, it sounds to me like you felt you had good relationships with each and support from each. But obviously there are some differences. So give us a little bit of insight into the differences between Secretary, what do we had? We had Perry, Aspen, and I'm forgetting the
Cohen.
third.
Bill
Yes.
Cohen.
Yeah. Talk about their differences specifically on the issue of environmental security, because everybody brings their own experiences to the position, and they had very different backgrounds coming in that would give them a unique angle on it.
Yes. Well, the first Secretary of Defense was Les Aspin. He'd been a congressman from Wisconsin. He'd been chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. He served not much more than a year, and in his time in service, he was really focused on reshaping defense strategy and policy after the Cold War.
Right.
I mean, he did care about environment and meeting, particularly on the closing bases and how we were going to do that. Um, uh, but his focus was very much in the work that was going on in the part of the Department of Defense we call OSD policy
Yeah.
at the time.
Yeah.
And so and then came Secretary Bill Perry, which many people was almost, they said he was like the accidental secretary, but turned out to be a brilliant manager, a brilliant, he'd been Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering before.
Hmm.
He was a mathematician. He'd run a number of companies, and he came from California. And he would, he said to me once, he said, "Look, I grew up with the smog in Southern California. I know how bad air pollution can be." And he said, so we've got to get this right. He also was brilliant at delegating. And so he knew what his priorities were. He held people to account with regular reviews, but he also empowered his team to really take on important issues. And I learned so much from working with him. And he also recognized good talent. He rewarded you when you did a good job. And he, just by his quiet presence, he almost just sort of encouraged people to want to be their best. So I had really deep, fond regard for Secretary Perry. And his focus at the end, his focus during this end of the Cold War period was a lot on denuclearizing the former Soviet Union with the Cooperative
Right.
Threat Reduction Program and many other, that series of existential risks that we faced at the time. And I had the opportunity to create, at his direction, something called Arctic Military Environmental Cooperation, when the Norwegian defense minister, his counterpart, said that Russian sunken and decommissioned submarines on the Kola Peninsula are posing a threat to Norwegian fishing grounds, and please engage the Russian military to help us reduce that risk. And Secretary Perry walked down to my office, something that rarely happened. Usually you go to the boss's office.
Yeah.
So he came down to my office one day and said, "Sherri, I just met with the Norwegian Minister of Defense, and he says we need to engage the Russian military to reduce the risk of these sunken submarines because they're threatening Norwegian fishing grounds." And over to you now. Figure it out. So that led to the creation of the Arctic Military Environmental Cooperation Program, which was emblematic of the mill-to-mill environmental cooperation we were doing in that era. Military to military environmental cooperation to engage militaries to be better stewards, to clean up waste, share best practices. Of course, we don't do that with Russia anymore today, but we do
For
do
different
that with
reasons.
militaries.
Sure. But now, was that tripartite? Was that U.S., Norway, Russia?
Yes, it
I'm
was a
curious, why
yes.
were other interested NATO members, or even non-NATO members, but I think it would have been easier military to military. For example, Canada or Denmark, because of Greenland and the Faroe Islands, had similar, if more distant interests. Was it simply because this was a venue, this was a way to engage the Russians because of the shared border with Norway and the proximity of the territorial waters?
Well, many of those nations did become involved in the program.
Oh,
So,
okay.
although the original agreement was signed with the three
Hmm.
nations, because it was at a time when the Russian military had very high regard for the US military,
Yeah.
and that's what was going to bring them to the table. But we did, of course, have the UK and Canada and the Danes and other NATO members involved with us in executing the program.
Yeah. Yeah. And in order to do it, you had to spend a lot of time in Russia. And I'm guessing that up until this point, you had not spent significant part of your life running around the Soviet Union and then in Russia after the dissolution. Talk about your experiences in Russia. What stood out to you the most, ranging from the attitude towards the environment to the distrust and concern about military to military contacts early on to vodka toasts, the whole range of things. Spending a lot of time in Russia is somewhat unique, and you got the chance to do it.
Yeah. Well, thank you, David. Yeah, I'd been to Russia actually once before I became Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security. Right after college during the height of the Cold War, when I stayed in tourist hotels and knew I was being followed everywhere,
Absolutely.
and knew that my room was being bugged. Okay, but now I go back and, I'm the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, and I'm often usually the head of the delegation. What did was most first of all, the military leaders and the others, and Russian scientists and others we engage with, were, for the most part, really leaning into this challenge. I mean, they wanted to make a difference.
Hmm.
It was as if a big weight had been lifted off them at the end of the Cold War,
Hmm.
and they believed in ecological security. Was the directorate was I had a 3-star who was my counterpart. He was head of ecological security. Now I will say that nothing happens, no negotiations happen in Russia without lots of drinking and toasts and vodka and caviar in those days. And, so I learned very quickly that I needed my designated drinker. Unfortunately, I always had um, uniformed officers on the delegation who were willing to
Able and
step in,
willing. Yes.
able and willing to fill that role.
Well, guess
And
what? From Secretary Perry, you learned the skill of delegation very well then.
there we go. Yes,
Yeah.
definitely in that way. Learned how to delegate the drinking. Um, the other thing I will say is they were very fond of children. I had young
Yeah.
children at the time. I
Mm.
was even a few times I was even pregnant when I went to Russia.
Hmm.
And they were very fond of my daughter. They adopted her as the mascot of the program, and they would send her cards, and
Yeah.
um,
I
so
think
they
people
were
miss that,
very
the real
people.
human
There was
element.
a whole person, people to
Yeah.
people quality of it.
Sure.
We brought the Russians to the U.S. many times,
Hmm.
and we met in Norway and other places. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds to me like you're illustrating something that gets lost so often when people talk about policies in the abstract and meetings in order to hash out agendas and all this. But it's about people, and finding ways to connect with people
Yes.
is so important, especially at this time. Like you said, some of these people, maybe many of them, seemed very interested in the actual topic, in the subject of environmental and ecological issues. And yet you didn't know exactly how much top cover do you have. Is this coming from the bosses, or is this something that you feel for the first time in your career in the former Soviet military, now the Russian military, that you have some ownership over? And you have to feel that out just by face to face talks.
Yes. So the negotiations would always start out with great warmth and enthusiasm, and then as we get towards the end in the brass tacks, particularly whenever there'd be any legal and liability provisions, and the lawyers and others would come in, that was
Mm.
always what would almost derail it
Yeah.
every time,
Yeah.
literally every time. But I must say, sometimes that happened on both sides. So
Yeah.
um, you had to really figure out how to uh,
Yeah.
work the system to get to a conclusion.
What a lot was accomplished in those years internationally, as well as in the United States, so of course, and our bases abroad. A lot of successes there, and I will point people to your book, Threat Multiplier, to read about some of those successes that the things that are happening today are really building on the foundation of. But I'd like you to share with us one missed opportunity. What's something from, I guess, early 1993 to very early 2001, during those 8 years you were in the position? What's something that, looking back, if we had the political will, or if we had the funding, or if we had more enlightened people working with you on a topic, what's something that could have gone even better?
I would say, David, it really wasn't until the mid 2000s and after that we took on understanding uh, the role of energy,
Mm.
and how the military uses energy um, as a
Right.
vulnerability
Right.
for the force. I mean,
Mm.
we knew some of that in the 90s, in the first era of kind of assessing how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Sure.
But when I requested the first study from the Defense Science Board on improved war fighting through reduced fuel burden, that's what we called it. Improved war fighting through reduced fuel burden.
Wow, that does
And
sound like a bureaucratic project.
exactly. And you've noticed it has says nothing about climate change, and it
Nope.
all it talks about is war fighting.
Yep.
And I had a number of 3 and 4 stars who were involved in leading that study, and they came out with a whole bunch of recommendations about how to improve fuel and energy efficiency
Hmm.
in the Department of Defense. And that came out. Well, it was commissioned in 1999, and it came out in early 2001 at the end of the administration. It was designed to come out for the beginning of the next administration, which was the Bush administration. But then after 9/11, the focus went elsewhere, and the
Hmm.
military didn't return to thinking about energy as a security issue, let alone um, a climate issue, till a half decade later. And by
Hmm.
that time, we were in Iraq and Afghanistan,
Right.
and our troops trucking fuel to the front were being put at risk from a deadly attack by improvised explosive devices. So,
Hmm. Hmm.
um, that it took a whole nother kind of half generation for to understand how to reduce energy vulnerabilities in warfighting.
I love the fact that you got to some of the energy issues. Like you said, we mention emissions and we mention the environmental impact, but that wasn't the lever. The lever was, building on the old line. I think it was Eisenhower who talked about all campaigns, battles, wars have been won or lost primarily due to logistics. You were playing on that and using that within the military because the fuel, it doesn't matter how good your tanks and your other equipment are if you don't have any fuel for them and can't get the fuel to them. So finding a way to make that more efficient actually, satisfies almost every constituency, which is brilliant.
The adage, amateurs talk strategy, but professionals talk logistics.
There it is, right? So
And I was
you,
in the logistics side of the Department of Defense. So
right.
I learned, that was where the environment security offices were, because
Hmm.
environment had been considered part of environment and logistics.
Yeah.
So that was important. People thought it was boring, but that's how men and material move.
Yeah. Well, you left that position, and you've worked with the everything from the Center for Naval Analyses to the Wilson Center since then. But you've been talking in many different venues in many different ways and doing work on a range of environmental security issues and the intersection of climate and global security since then. On this podcast, we've spoken with people like Aaron Sikorsky and Marisol Maddox on Arctic issues as well. But I'd like to get your take on some of the substantive issues, especially how the views on them have evolved from the 1990s to today. So I'll just pick some at random, and I'd like to just hear your quick take on how you think that the way we even look at these issues has evolved, but then the advances we've made and how we incorporate thoughts about them into military planning and execution. First of all, just the issue of resources, the issue of the fact that with climate change, there's things in the Arctic and even Antarctica that are going to be more available, and therefore geopolitical competition heats up. We're now able to drill in places we couldn't drill before. There's rare earths that are exposed because of some of the melting ice. Talk about the perspective on how resource availability would become a military issue as a result of climate change from the 90s to today.
Well, essentially, it comes down to what kind of presence do you need, and
Hmm.
how do you manage risk. Um, in the Cold War in the 1990s, we provided defense and deterrence throughout the Arctic region through our submarine forces, missile forces, space forces. We didn't see a large need to have surface level capability to operate in the Arctic, um, because there wasn't much happening up there beyond, serving local communities, indigenous communities. and then some limited resource extraction. But today, with an increasingly open Arctic, and as sea ice retreats, permafrost thaws and melts, and temperatures rise, Putin envisions a toll road for President Putin of Russia envisions the Northern Sea Route as a toll road for transportation from ports in Asia to ports in Europe, and is trying to monetize that asset, also nuclearizing his capabilities with 40 some odd icebreakers and floating nuclear power plants,
Yeah. Hmm.
and using the military to ensure, in the first instance, the economic resources of that region. So, um, and meanwhile, China eyes the Arctic as a near Arctic stakeholder, would like access to some of those energy resources, says it visions future shorter shipping routes, and maybe in the future the fish. And Russia just this
Right.
last summer allowed for a non-ice clad vessel to
Hmm.
transit the Arctic, and while there wasn't an accident, the near-term risks are really of an accident,
Right.
or that could lead to miscalculation. So what
Right.
happens if a Russian icebreaker collides, in the Bering Strait, where the U.S. and
Hmm.
Russia are only 50 miles apart,
Mm.
with its Chinese liquid natural gas fuel tanker, and there's maybe an
Mm.
oil spill or other hazardous waste, or some radiological incident, or need
Yeah.
for a search and rescue of personnel,
Mm.
and you're in international waters, and there's a lot of information you don't have, and probably also misinformation. So what kinds of capabilities? Today, we use mostly our Coast Guard through, let's say, the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, to exercise to the capabilities to address an oil spill or a search and rescue in that region.
Yeah.
And, while it's good, it's probably not going to be enough if there's some serious incident, because we know that our military in the end would always need to be able, and then we also need, as our military would say, to be operate in and through the Arctic, not just in, but through the Arctic.
Right.
And so in recent years, our forces, expeditionary strike groups, have begun to activate surface capability and retrain operating in
Hmm.
different Arctic environments, something that, of course, our Nordic high north neighbors have been doing for a long time.
That's
And
right.
now at least we're blessed with having Finland and Sweden
Yep.
in Norway, so we have a strengthened capability.
Hmm.
Um,
Like my dogs, they're very excited to have our new Swedish and Finnish partners in NATO, and my dogs hear that and they have to speak up in support as well.
there we go. Okay.
I want to build on something you just said there, which is related to that. It's about operating in and through these areas, but that requires facilities. And I think when we think about environmental change and facilities, we too easily just go to Norfolk and we think about sea rise issues, or you think about Basin California and the increased wildfires, and that's all good and necessary. We need to think about hurricanes and how they're impacting military facilities, but I think what's gotten less attention in the general public is the fact that so many bases and facilities in northern climates are built on permafrost. And there are real environmental issues in terms of the viability of these locations at all with any of their existing infrastructure. You had to deal with that starting in the 90s, but you've been analyzing this ever since then and calling attention to it. Talk through that dynamic, both how serious a problem it is and the ways that we can get ahead of it.
Right. Well, erosion has been occurring for a long time now, followed by permafrost thaw and collapse. And U.S. military facilities in the Arctic, from the old former DEW line sites to other um, defense early warning sites that then we've converted into some, northern radar sites now under NORAD, or other capabilities, the U.S. and Canada. So we have to ensure that those facilities are resilient in the face of climate impacts, which can include erosion, permafrost thaw and melt, sometimes leading to flooding, or reducing the accessibility of the road network that gives you access to those facilities. Now, Russia has built a lot more infrastructure in its permafrost and has whole industrialized cities. there. So they have greater risk. And if you think about Russian infrastructure in general, it doesn't make you sleep well at night because even in, you know, the non-permafrost areas, if you've been in Russia, you see that, much is left to be desired in terms of the safety and integrity of it. And so now you've got infrastructure in the permafrost, and it's thawing and collapsing. And while there's great talent, in Russia, scientific talent in Russia, and individual talent in scientific organizations, the will to sort of ensure that accidents don't happen is just really unclear to us. So I think you have that risk
Yeah.
of permafrost thaw and collapse that could lead to either uh, human, accidents for humans, but also infrastructure loss or widespread
Hmm.
ecological damage in some of these areas.
Yeah. Another aspect of this that Aaron in particular has been calling a lot of attention to in social media is just how active militaries around the world, but especially the US military, have become in environmental response. And it's not necessarily new. Disaster relief as a military function, even in the US context, goes way, way back. But as a percentage of resources allocated, as a matter of frequency instead of an odd rarity, it's absolutely amazing on everything from helping to clean up oil spills to working on firefighting missions. It seems to be that this is something that the clock is not going to turn backwards on, and we need to realize that the environmental military mix goes in multiple directions.
Right. We have at the Center for Climate and Security, which Aaron leads, and for which I chair the board of the overall organization, and a tool called the Military Response to Climate Hazards Tracker,
Right.
MERCH, we call it. And so Erin and her team are carefully tracking events around the world, and we see increase just since it started a few years ago. Many more incidents of militaries being called up to respond to fires, flood, other extreme weather events, and there's just no question that that is likely to continue because local communities just don't have the capacity. Our own National Guard, is called up now at 10 times the frequency it was just 5 years ago to respond to wildfires in the West. And we saw, in the fall, the military is responding to fires in Greece and flooding in Portugal. And I heard the same this morning when I was speaking to a group in Brazil. They're having the same kinds of increased demand signal for military to back up first responders.
Yeah, and this is an issue that I hope there's a lot of server power being dedicated to that tracker because it seems like it's just growing and growing and growing, and great that it's being documented for researchers and policymakers to see. Another issue that I had not thought about, and you write about as a topic of interest in your book, is just how different rainfall patterns affect security. Experts and analysts have been looking at this for decades. I remember reading about it in graduate school. In the late 80s and 90s, there were people starting to look in international security at issues of drought and water resources spurring conflict. So we all see that all too easily in places like Syria with the civil war. But one aspect of it I hadn't thought about was the issue of changing rainfall patterns for things like the Panama Canal. That if you don't have enough water coming from the skies, you're not going to be able to operate the locks during times of drought. That is absolutely crucial when you think about the necessity of the canal and what it allows U.S. surface vessels to do moving between the Atlantic and the Pacific. That's something that I don't think was anticipated several decades ago, but now it's all too clear that this could have catastrophic effects on movement of U.S. equipment.
Right, absolutely. I mean, most major infrastructure is not climate proofed. Particularly, the canal, well over 100 years old. It's a landmark of engineering and an enormous feat. but it does suffer from lower water levels today, which could compromise its integrity in the future and therefore put global shipping and U.S. force posture at some peril.
Absolutely. One other substantive issue before I get to some of your thoughts and recommendations for the future is the issue of training, both how military training affects the environment, but also how the environment has limited, or in some cases actually opened up new avenues for realistic training. Talk through how you conceptualized that back in the 90s and how you think that the thinking about it has evolved today.
Right. Well, I mean, the story I tell in the book is how training had been stopped at certain bases in the 1990s for failure to protect endangered species that live on many military bases because they're islands of nature. And the red cockaded woodpecker makes its home in the longleaf pine tree, which once covered much of the southeast and is now found mostly on military bases. And the army had training partially halted at Fort Bragg, now Fort Liberty, for failure to protect the ecosystem, the nest of this bird. And so, what's an Army general to do? Well, General Gordon Sullivan, then Army Chief of Staff, and his Marine counterpart, General Chuck Krulak at the time, and their teams figured out that, in fact, they didn't need to cut down the tree. It could become a realistic training obstacle, and
Right on.
therefore it could actually enhance military training and readiness.
Right on.
And that led to a whole campaign of the Marines. We're saving a few good species, a play on the Marines theme. And so I think that theme we see, carried through today in the climate era. We see that, in the first instance, you think that, military training and environmental protection can't be compatible. And then you look further into it and you unpack it a little bit and you realize, okay, actually, maybe you can and probably can be. And, the military is actually very proud of its environmental stewardship record. And our members of our armed forces, our soldier, sailor, airman, and marine, they join to defend the country in all parts of the country, and from sea to shining sea means also our beautiful natural heritage.
Yeah. You have said before that one of your goals is to change thinking around these issues, to transform climate change as a conceptual idea of a threat multiplier, which it objectively is, but transform it to an opportunity multiplier. And you've created four buckets that are important to do this, going from awareness through adaptation and mitigation, and then interestingly, including alliances, which you've had a lot of experience building and enhancing. Talk through each of these. Start with awareness and talk through your top line recommendations for how all of us, but particularly the U.S. military and policymakers involved in military affairs, can start thinking of climate change as something that brings advantages if approached correctly.
Right. Well, thank you, David, for teeing it up that way. So, yes, I do think of climate and environmental security as giving us the opportunity to create, an opportunity multiplier. And, starting with awareness, in this era, we need really good climate intelligence, if you will. We need to close the gap, as we say, between weather and climate, between short-term weather forecasts and longer-term climate predictions. In between that is what we call climate variability. What is drought and rainfall going to look like for next year's agricultural season if you're in the agricultural sector, but what's it going to look like for instability where our forces might need to deploy, and what kind of planning do we need to do around that? So that's how to close that gap, to have climate intelligence for responsible defense decision making. And that's a combination of advances being made in science, but also science research and technology, AI, quantum computing, and downscaled modeling, into decision tools that can be used to create climate dashboards, climate assessment tools, and climate infused war games, for
Yep.
example.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one area. And then the second is adapting or becoming resilient in the face of climate risks that are already baked into society. I mean, we've already
Yep.
at the 1.5 degree C level above
Right.
baseline climate, and we're still on the way up. And so we will be experiencing hotter temperatures, warmer oceans, more sea level rise, stronger storms. So, how do we become resilient in the face of that, both in our base infrastructure and for our troops who have to operate in hotter temperatures and colder temperatures in the Arctic and have to be able to move in and through that and be protected and have safe equipment and have their health insured so they're not unnecessarily subject to heat stress and heat stroke, for example,
Mm-hmm.
or disease exposure. Um, so that's resilience. Third, it's about mitigation, sort of reducing emissions. And when you look at
Right.
military's use of energy, about 1% of total US energy, and most of it being in what we call operational energy. So it's about how can you turn that lever? How do you decarbonize into sustainable aviation and maritime fuels in the future? But first and foremost, probably more efficient weapon system design or efficient
Mm-hmm.
use of weapons platforms on current fuel systems, and or looking at how a variety of advanced energy, everything from nuclear to hybrid to renewables to hydrogen, can give you improved military effectiveness. Everything from your aircraft to your tanks to your ships and beyond. And then finally, and then moving to net zero. So there's an ambitious goal in the Department of Defense to have net zero military bases by 2035 for electricity and 2050 overall. So we have microgrids being deployed at many military bases today that will enable us to have energy resilience. You have to be able to operate 2 weeks now off grid. And a microgrid enables you to do that so you can do your black start exercise,
Yeah.
and then you can at the same time enable distributed energy resources to be put onto that microgrid at a local level. Every place is different. The first net zero military base in Albany, Georgia, Marine Corps Logistics Base, has a waste to energy plant where they're extracting methane from an old landfill. So at some bases you can do that. Other bases you have other energy sources. So, and it's always a mix. Um, and then finally, it's about our allies and our partners and integrating climate security and climate security risks and opportunities into our alliances. So, using NATO as an example, which has had a very forward leaning climate security action plan for the last several years, and just this last year launched the first NATO Center on Climate and Security, which is hosted by Canada in Montreal, was launched at the NATO summit in Washington, and just a few weeks ago held the first Montreal Climate and Security Summit that I was privileged to keynote.
Yeah. There's a whole lot there, and you have many ideas from the strategic framing to tactical issues that are contained into the book. I'll point people to once more, which is Threat Multiplier, Climate, Military Leadership, and the Fight for Global Security. I want to thank you for writing that. I want to thank you for spending time with us, but we're not done yet because I get to reach into our chatterbox and find you a random question to answer. Sherri, please recommend any recent book you've read or podcast you've listened to or TV show you've watched, something that you think people would get something out of that you've been able to come across.
Okay, well, I just finished reading David Sanger's The New Cold Wars, and
Ah,
I think he's a very good writer, and he really kind of explains well what's happening as between Russia, China, and the U.S. from a kind of a U.S. perspective in the rise of
mm-hmm.
Cold Wars, and he really accounts in many ways for some of the things that we've talked about here, although that's not his focus in depth, but it's his understanding and reflection as well. And so I think that is a good book. But just to give you another book I just started reading, which I think is just a brilliant and fun read,
Mm,
is the new book Orbital. It's a novel by Samantha Harvey about um, a mixed group of astronauts in space and how they experience space and kind of what their relationships are both to each other and the natural world. And sometimes I think for us professionals who are very deep in the here and now and the evidence based, which is important, it's also important to let your mind go a little bit
Hmm.
and sort of give yourself a release in a certain way so that you can both relax but think some other different and new thoughts. So I recommend Orbital.
I'm fascinated and intrigued. Is the nature of the mission they are on, as the title suggests, something in Earth orbit, or is it an exploration mission further on?
Well, it's a space station, so
Okay, got it.
there we go.
Okay, fascinating. Well, we're going to include both of those books in our show notes for people who are interested, as well as a link to yours. Sherri Goodman,
But I
thanks for
couldn't
spending
wait.
time
Can
with
I
us.
add one more book, please? I have to because my
Even
colleague
better.
My colleague Peter Schwartzstein has written a brilliant book about climate violence called "The Heat and the Fury." The
Ooh,
Heat and the Fury. Peter Schwartzstein, and he's a climate journalist, and he's
yep,
traveled, throughout the Middle East, North Africa, Southeast Asia, reporting from the front lines, particularly how drought is afflicting and leading to violence and instability. And some of the stories are heartrending, but they are
yeah,
also at a level of sort of detail that I think is important for people in this field to know.
that's great. You said The Heat and the Fury?
Yes, the
Yeah.
heat and the
Okay,
fury.
we'll note that as well. You've given people three good recommendations to close out the year with, so I hope you're getting residuals from them. Sherri, thanks again so much. This was wonderful. I learned a lot. I enjoyed hearing your stories. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, David. It's been a pleasure.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter at That Was Chatter.